Hey, what is up, everyone? I hope you guys are doing well. Today we have a unique story narrated by my friend Frederick. I hope you guys enjoy it and watch till the end, guys.
In the vast darkness between stars, where empires rise and fall like the drawing of breath, there exist warriors so ancient that their very existence challenges our understanding of time itself. On one side, entombed heroes of the Imperium, their living consciousness bound within shells of auramite and adamantium, kept alive by technologies that predate the rise of mankind. On the other, skeletal legions of living metal, awakening from a slumber that began before the first humans walked upright on distant Terra. When these forces meet on the battlefield, something remarkable happens. Something that reveals the cold, calculating intelligence behind the Necron advance. The ancient warriors in their golden sarcophagi stride forward, weapons charged and ready for combat. And the Necrons, those supposedly mindless automatons of destruction, make a choice that speaks volumes about the nature of their intelligence. They withdraw. This isn't fear. The Necrons know nothing of fear anymore. Their capacity for such emotions burned away in the biotransference that transformed them from flesh to metal 60 million years ago. This isn't cowardice either. These are the same warriors who fought the old ones to extinction, who shattered star gods and brought entire civilizations to their knees. No, when Necrons phase out, rather than engage ancient Custodian Dreadnoughts in prolonged combat, they're making a calculated decision based on strategic mathematics that spans eons. They're applying lessons learned across millions of years of warfare, weighing costs against benefits with a precision that would make any Imperial strategist weep with envy. To understand why the Necrons make this choice requires us to delve deep into the histories of both factions. We must walk the halls of the Imperial Palace and see how the Custodian Guard are forged, one perfect warrior at a time. We must descend into the tomb worlds and witness the awakening of consciousness that has slumbered since before the rise of the Eldari. We must understand what it means when technology from the dark age of technology meets technology from an age even darker, when the galaxy was young and gods walked among mortals. Only then can we begin to comprehend the strategic calculus that drives the Necron nobility to preserve their forces, rather than throw them against these particular foes. The story begins, not in the 41st millennium, but in ages past. It begins with the creation of warriors, who were never meant to be soldiers in a conquering army, but guardians who would stand watch over the greatest treasure humanity would ever produce. It begins with the Emperor of Mankind, working in his hidden laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, crafting something that had never existed before and would never be replicated again. It begins with the Custodian Guard. The Emperor's own, understanding the Custodian Guard. To comprehend why a Custodian entombed within a dreadnought represents such a formidable opponent that even the ancient Necrons think twice about engaging them, we must first understand what makes the Custodian Guard unique among all the warriors of the Imperium. These are not space marines, though the uninitiated often make that mistake. The differences between a Custodian and an Astartes are as profound as the differences between an Astartes and a normal human. Perhaps more so, for the process that creates a Custodian is fundamentally different from anything else in the Imperium's arsenal. Each Custodian is not mass-produced like the Space Marines, whose transformation follows a relatively standardized process of implantation and indoctrination. Instead, every single member of the Adeptus Custodes is a unique work of art, handcrafted by the Emperor himself, or by his most skilled gene-wrights, following techniques that only they understand. The creation of a Custodian begins at the genetic level, with an infant candidate selected from among the noble families of Terra. From that moment forward, every cell in their body is rewritten, restructured, and perfected through processes that make the creation of a space marine look crude by comparison. The Emperor didn't create the Custodes to be soldiers in the traditional sense. He created them to be companions, protectors, and perhaps most importantly, incorruptible guardians who could stand in his presence without being overwhelmed by his psychic might. Where Space Marines are created to think as brothers, to fight as a collective force multiplying their effectiveness through coordinated tactics and mutual support, Custodians are crafted to be perfect individual warriors. Each one is a master of single combat, capable of analyzing and countering any threat through their own skill and perception. They don't need to rely on their brothers because each one is, in effect, a one-man army. This philosophy of creation has profound implications for their combat effectiveness. A Custodian's mind is not just enhanced, but fundamentally restructured to process threats and formulate responses at speeds that defy normal human comprehension. They are programmed, for lack of a better word, with an encyclopedic knowledge of every form of combat, every weapon system, every tactical doctrine they might encounter. But it goes beyond mere knowledge. Their minds are wired to perceive threats before they fully manifest, to understand the flow of battle in ways that seem almost precognitive. They can read an opponent's body language, assess their skill level, and formulate 17 different ways to kill them in the time it takes a normal human to recognize danger. The Emperor armed them with weapons and armor that reflect this individual excellence. Custodian war gear is not produced in factories or churned out by Forge Worlds. Each piece is handcrafted by the finest artificers in the Imperium, blessed by the highest-ranking tech priests, and imbued with technologies that the Mechanicus can maintain but no longer fully understands. The Auramite armor they wear is stronger than the Ceramite of Space Marine power armor, lighter, more responsive, and capable of turning aside blows that would shatter lesser protection. Their Guardian spears are masterworks that combine a power blade capable of carving through tank armor with an integrated bolt caster of devastating precision. Every piece of their equipment is irreplaceable, each weapon worth more than most Imperial worlds. During the Great Crusade, when the Emperor still walked among men and led humanity's conquest of the stars, the Custodian Guard fought alongside him in the greatest battles. There are records, fragmentary and heavily censored, of engagements where a single shield company of 300 Custodians broke the spine of an Orc empire that had been ravaging the galactic northeast for decades. They deployed alongside 1,000 of their number to support the Primarchs Mortarion and Horus in a campaign against an Orc war chief, whose forces numbered in the millions. The Custodians suffered 3 casualties. 3. Out of 1,000 warriors engaging an enemy that outnumbered them 300 to 1, only 3 fell in battle. The Orc Empire was annihilated. This is the baseline from which we must understand Custodian combat effectiveness. These are warriors who can, and have, cut through entire armies with minimal losses. Their skill in battle is such that even the greatest champions of other races give them a wide berth when possible. Aeldari Exarchs, warriors who have walked the path of the warrior for centuries and become avatars of combat excellence, have been recorded engaging in single combat with Custodians. The engagements are brief, brutal, and almost always end with the Aeldari warrior's death. Chaos Space Marines, veterans of 10,000 years of constant warfare, avoid them when tactical situations allow. Even the tyrannid hive mind, that alien intelligence that views all other life as mere biomass to be consumed, has been observed redirecting swarm assaults away from concentrations of Custodian forces, choosing to spend its resources elsewhere. But there is an even more crucial aspect to understanding the Custodians that becomes relevant when we discuss their Dreadnoughts. The warriors who become Custodians are not just physically and mentally enhanced beyond normal human limits. They are, each one, bonded to the Emperor himself in ways that the Imperium scholars still don't fully understand. There is a connection, psychic or spiritual, or perhaps both, that links every Custodian to the master of mankind. This bond doesn't break when their body is destroyed. It doesn't fade when they are interred within the cold shell of a dreadnought. If anything, the extended lifespan that comes with being entombed only strengthens this connection, allowing them to draw on reserves of will and determination that would be impossible for lesser warriors. The Adeptus Custodes have stood vigil over the Emperor since before the Unification Wars that brought terror under his rule. They have witnessed the birth of the Imperium, the triumph of the Great Crusade, the catastrophe of the Horus Heresy, and the long, grinding millennia of warfare that followed. Some of them, the oldest of the ancient ones, have memories that stretch back to times when the Emperor walked openly among men, when his plans for humanity were still unfolding according to his design. These memories don't fade when a custodian is interred. They are preserved, crystallized within the consciousness that survives within the Dreadnoughts' sarcophagus. And this continuity of experience, this unbroken chain of memory spanning 10,000 years or more, makes ancient Custodian Dreadnoughts something truly exceptional. Entombed excellence, the Custodian Dreadnought. When a Custodian suffers wounds so catastrophic that even their phenomenal physiology cannot recover, when their body is broken beyond the ability of the Imperium's finest medici to repair, a choice must be made. For a Space Marine, the decision to enter them within a Dreadnought is considered an honor, a way for their service to continue beyond the normal span of mortality. For a Custodian, it is something else entirely. It is martyrdom. It is sacrifice. It is the conscious decision to surrender everything that made their existence bearable in exchange for the ability to continue protecting the Emperor. The Dreadnoughts used by the Adeptus Custodes are not the standard patterns used by Space Marine chapters throughout the Imperium. They cannot be. A normal Dreadnought chassis, built to house the broken form of an Astartes, would be insufficient to contain the consciousness and capabilities of a Custodian. Instead, the Custodes make use of ancient Contemptor pattern Dreadnoughts, relics from the days of the Great Crusade, when such war machines were the pinnacle of the Imperium's military technology. But even these are not simply taken from existing stocks. Each Custodian Dreadnought is extensively modified, refitted with systems and technologies that make them superior to their Space Marine equivalents in every measurable way. The most common pattern is the Contemptor Achilles Dreadnought, named for one of the earliest Custodians to be so interred. These machines were already formidable when first developed, combining phenomenal strength and speed with armor thick enough to shrug off Lascanon fire. The modifications made for Custodian use enhance these capabilities even further. The reactors that power them are more efficient, generating more energy while producing less waste heat. The servo motors that move their massive limbs respond faster, allowing for movements that approach the fluidity of a living warrior. The armor plating is auramite rather than ceramite, providing superior protection while maintaining the same weight. Every system is handcrafted, every component blessed and sanctified by the highest-ranking members of the Mechanicus. The weapons mounted on a Contemptor Achilles speak to its role as a close combat specialist. The primary armament is a massive dread spear, modeled after the Guardian Spear, wielded by standard Custodians, but scaled up to match the Dreadnought's size. This weapon is a masterwork of engineering, combining a power blade capable of punching through the heaviest armor with an integrated Lastrum bolt cannon that can lay down withering fire at range. The Dreadspear is mounted on articulated joints that allow it to be wielded with surprising dexterity, the Custodian within using it much as they would have used their original weapon when they still walked in flesh and blood. When a Contemptor Achilles closes with the enemy, the result is devastating. The Dreadspear carves through battle tanks and monstrous creatures with equal ease, while the bolt cannon picks off any enemies foolish enough to remain within range. But the Contemptor Achilles is not the only pattern available to the Custodes. There is also the Contemptor Galatus, a variant designed to serve as an anchor point for Custodian battle lines. Where the Achilles emphasizes offensive power, the Galatus is built around the concept of an immovable defense. It wields a massive Galatus warblade, an enormous power sword that can cleave through entire ranks of enemy infantry with single sweeping strikes. More importantly, it carries a Presidium shield, essentially a man-portable void shield, scaled up to Dreadnought size. This shield doesn't just deflect incoming fire, it actively disrupts energy weapons and causes kinetic projectiles to lose coherence before they reach the Dreadnought's armor. A Contemptor Galatus advancing at the head of a Custodian formation is a terrifying sight. Arrows and bullets and laser blasts simply dissipating against its shield while it closes the distance to the enemy line. Then there are the Telemon Heavy Dreadnoughts, machines so rare and powerful that only a handful were ever constructed. These are not simply larger versions of the Contemptor pattern. They are entirely different beasts, standing nearly twice the height of a standard Dreadnought and massing considerably more. A Telemon is less a walking war machine and more a mobile fortress, armed with weapons that can annihilate battle tanks at extreme range and protected by layered void shields that can turn aside all but the most concentrated fire. The honor of being interred within a Telemon sarcophagus is reserved for only the most celebrated Custodian warriors, those whose service to the Emperor has been so exemplary that they are judged worthy of piloting these incredible machines. All Custodian Dreadnoughts, regardless of pattern, incorporate technology that sets them apart from their Imperial counterparts. The most significant of these is the Atomantic Shielding System, an energy field generator that creates a protective barrier around the Dreadnought. This isn't simply a void shield like those carried by Imperial Knights or Titans. Atomantic shielding operates on principles that even the Mechanicus doesn't fully understand, manipulating fundamental forces at a quantum level to disrupt incoming attacks. When a weapon strikes an atomantic shield, the energy is shunted away, dispersed across multiple dimensions, rendered harmless before it can reach the Dreadnought's hull. The shields can absorb tremendous amounts of damage before finally collapsing, and even when they do fail, they regenerate far faster than conventional void shields. The warriors entombed within these machines are not diminished by their transformation. If anything, their capabilities are enhanced in certain ways. The Dreadnought's targeting systems are linked directly to the Custodian's perceptions, allowing them to process battlefield information at speeds that defy belief. Their weapons are integrated with their consciousness so thoroughly that aiming becomes an act of will rather than a mechanical process. They can perceive threats from 360 degrees simultaneously, track multiple targets at once, and make split-second tactical decisions that would overwhelm lesser minds. The martial skills they spent decades or centuries perfecting remain intact, translated through the Dreadnought systems into movements that blur the line between machine and living warrior. But there is a cost. The process of interment strips away almost everything that made the Custodian human. The flesh of their body is rendered down, reduced to little more than a collection of organs and brain matter suspended within an armored sarcophagus. They lose the ability to taste, to feel texture, to experience physical sensation in any normal sense. Their existence becomes one of isolation, cut off from the sensory richness that makes life worth living. Between battles, they are often placed into induced coma states, kept in deep storage within the halls of the Imperial Palace or aboard the warships that serve as mobile bases for Custodian strike forces. When they are awakened, it is only for war. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, Custodian Dreadnoughts represent some of the most dangerous warriors in the entire Imperium. They possess all the skills, all the knowledge, all the tactical genius of the Custodian they once were, combined with the resilience and firepower of a machine that can shrug off damage that would kill a dozen Space Marines. They don't know fear, not because it was programmed out of them, but because they have transcended it. Death has already claimed them once. What remains is purpose, pure and focused and absolutely unwavering. When a Custodian Dreadnought strides onto the battlefield, it does so with the certainty that it will triumph or be destroyed in the attempt, and either outcome is acceptable so long as the Emperor is served. It's this combination of ancient technology, supreme martial skill, and unbreakable will that makes these machines such formidable opponents. An enemy facing a standard Space Marine Dreadnought knows they're dealing with a dangerous foe, but one that can be overcome with sufficient firepower or tactical cleverness. An enemy facing a Custodian Dreadnought knows they're dealing with something far worse, a being that combines the power of a walking tank with the skill of the greatest warrior they've ever encountered. And for the Necrons, with their perfect strategic calculus and their ability to remember lessons learned across millions of years, this presents a very specific problem. The Necrons, ancient beyond reckoning. To understand the Necron perspective requires us to step outside the boundaries of normal human timescales. When we speak of ancient history, we might refer to events that occurred millennia ago, perhaps 10,000 years in the case of the Horus Heresy. The Necrons were already ancient when the first humans were learning to make fire. They had built and lost an empire spanning the galaxy before the first single-celled organism appeared in Terra's primordial oceans. Their perspective on time, on war, on the value of individual battles and campaigns is so fundamentally different from that of younger races that it becomes almost incomprehensible. The Necrons began their existence as the Necrontyre, a humanoid species whose homeworld orbited a star that bathed them in deadly radiation. Life for the Necrontyre was brutally short, their bodies constantly ravaged by cancers and cellular breakdown caused by their sun's intense emissions. They built their civilization in the shadow of death, creating vast tomb complexes and memorial structures while living in temporary, almost temporary dwellings. Death was so central to their culture that when they finally achieved spaceflight and spread to other worlds, they took their morbid preoccupations with them. Other species flourished across the galaxy, living lives measured in centuries or longer. The Necrontyre died young and bitter, filled with envy for those who possessed what they could never have: time. Their jealousy focused particularly on the Old Ones, an ancient race of near-immortal beings who had mastered technologies that seemed like magic to lesser species. The Old Ones could manipulate space and time, create life with a thought, and walk between stars using their webway, a network of tunnels through alternate dimensions. When the Necrontyre, desperate for a solution to their mortality, petitioned the Old Ones to share their secrets of longevity, they were refused. The Old Ones saw the Necrontyre's short lifespans not as a curse to be cured, but as a natural part of their existence, something that should not be interfered with. This refusal, whether born of wisdom or arrogance, would prove to be one of the greatest mistakes in galactic history. The Necrontyre declared war on the Old Ones, and for a time, it seemed as though their advanced technology might carry the day despite their physical limitations. But the Old Ones' mastery of the warp, their ability to appear and disappear at will through the webway, proved impossible to counter. The Necrontyre were driven back, pushed to the edges of the galaxy, their empire reduced to scattered remnants clinging to survival in the halo stars. It was at this moment of greatest desperation that they encountered the Satan, entities of living energy that fed on the radiation of stars. The Necrontyre built bodies of living metal to contain these star gods, and in exchange, the Satan offered them exactly what they'd been seeking: immortality. The biotransference that followed was not what the Necrontyre expected. They entered the great conversion furnaces as living beings, flesh and blood and soul. They emerged as machines, their consciousness transferred into shells of necrodermis, while the Satan feasted on their life force. What made them individuals, what gave them personality and dreams and the capacity for growth, was consumed by the hungry star gods. The vast majority of the Necrontyre were reduced to little more than automatons, their minds simplified to the point where they could follow orders but little else.
You know, I've been researching Warhammer lore for quite a while now, and this is one of those topics that really makes you appreciate how deep Games Workshop's world building goes. Most factions and fictions just throw their armies at each other until one side wins, but the Necrons, they're literally doing cost-benefit analysis on the battlefield. It's wild to think about these ancient robotic skeletons running calculations like, is destroying this one really expensive golden boy worth losing 3 weeks of repair time? That's not how we usually think about warfare in sci-fi, right? We expect honored duels and last stands, not strategic spreadsheets. But when you've been alive for 60 million years, I guess you learn something that sometimes the smartest move is just to walk away and hit them somewhere they're not expecting. It's honestly what makes the Necrons so terrifying. They're patient enough to wait 1,000 years for a better opportunity. Anyways, let's get back to the story.
Only the nobility retained some measure of true consciousness, and even they were diminished, their emotions flattened, their capacity for independent thought constrained by the cold logic of their mechanical forms. But they gained what they sought. They became immortal, unkillable save through the most extreme applications of force. And they gained weapons, technology gifted by the Cetan that made their previous arsenals look like children's toys. Gauss flayers that could strip the very matter from enemy bodies, atom by atom. Particle whips that disrupted molecular bonds. Weapons that manipulated time itself, aging enemies to dust in seconds or trapping them in temporal loops. With these tools, the Necrons returned to their war against the Old Ones, and this time, they were winning. The war in heaven that followed consumed the galaxy for what modern scholars believe was approximately 5 million years. 5 million years of constant warfare, of entire solar systems being extinguished, of reality itself being torn apart by the conflict between the material forces of the Cetan and Necrons and the psychic might of the Old Ones and their created races. The Necrons learned warfare at a scale and over durations that make the conflicts of the 41st millennium seem like brief skirmishes by comparison. They developed tactics not just for individual battles, but for campaigns that might span millennia. They learned to think in terms of strategic objectives that would only bear fruit thousands of years after the forces were set in motion. The war ended not with the Necrons' victory over the Old Ones, though they did ultimately drive that ancient race to extinction or flight, but with the Silent King's recognition that the Catan had betrayed them. The Star Gods viewed the Necrons as nothing more than convenient tools, slaves to be used and discarded. In a moment of unprecedented coordination, the Necrons rose up against their masters, shattering the Cetan into thousands of shards that could be imprisoned and controlled. But this victory came at tremendous cost. The Necrons were exhausted, their numbers depleted by millions of years of constant warfare. And they saw that the Aeldari, one of the races created by the Old Ones to fight against them, were rising to replace the Old Ones as the galaxy's dominant power. Rather than face the Aeldari at the height of their power while the Necrons were weakened, the Silent King made a decision that would define his race for the next 60 million years. He ordered the Necrons to enter stasis, to sleep in great tomb complexes buried beneath the surfaces of countless worlds, waiting for a time when the galaxy would be ripe for conquest once more. The tombs were set to awaken at preset intervals, allowing the Necrons to assess the state of the galaxy and either continue their slumber or begin their campaigns of reconquest. And so the Necrons slept, their consciousness suspended in dreamless void, while the galaxy evolved without them. 60 million years passed. The Eldari rose to dominate the stars, building an empire of unparalleled sophistication and power. They fell, consumed by their own excesses, birthing a new chaos god in the process. Humanity evolved from simple primates to starfaring civilization, experienced its own golden age of technology, fell into barbarism during the Age of Strife, and was united by the Emperor to build the Imperium. The Horus Heresy shattered humanity's dreams of galactic dominance. The long war against chaos ground on for 10,000 years. And through it all, the Necrons slept, unaware and uncaring about the changes unfolding around them. When they began to wake in the late 41st millennium, they found a galaxy both familiar and strange. There was war, as there had always been war. There were younger races squabbling over territory and resources, much as they had in the age when the Necrons first rose to power, but the specific threats were different. The Imperium of Man controlled half the galaxy through sheer weight of numbers and fanatical devotion to their corpse god Emperor. The Orcs spread like a plague across every contested region, The Tyranids, an extragalactic horror that hadn't existed when the Necrons entered their tombs, consumed everything in their path. The forces of chaos, much stronger now than they had been during the war in heaven, threatened to tear reality itself apart. The Necrons who woke to face these threats were not the same warriors who had fought the old ones. 60 million years of stasis had taken its toll. Many tomb worlds had been damaged by tectonic shifts or discovered by younger races and looted or destroyed. The Necrons who emerged from their tombs often suffered from degraded consciousness, their mechanical minds worn down by eons of inactivity. Some awoke as little more than shambling automatons, capable of following basic programming but incapable of independent thought. Others retained their intelligence but had become unhinged, their personalities fragmenting under the weight of isolation and time. But some, particularly among the nobility and the most ancient of warriors, awakened with their faculties intact. These Necrons remembered the war in heaven, not as distant history, but as something that had happened recently from their perspective. They remembered the lessons learned over millions of years of combat. They remembered which tactics worked and which didn't, which enemies were worth fighting and which should be avoided or manipulated. And as they began to assess the threats facing their race in this new age, they began to apply those ancient lessons to modern conflicts. 60 million years of memory. Memory is a strange thing for the Necrons. They are machines now, their consciousness maintained by quantum processors and energy fields rather than organic neurons. This should theoretically give them perfect recall, the ability to access any moment from their past with crystalline clarity. But memory doesn't work that way, even for mechanical minds. The act of remembering is itself a form of change, a process that subtly alters the thing being remembered. And across 60 million years, even the most perfectly preserved memories begin to degrade, to shift, to transform into something that's not quite what originally happened. The typical Necron warrior retains almost nothing of their past. The biotransference robbed them of the complexity needed to maintain detailed memories, reducing their consciousness to something barely above an automaton. They follow orders, they execute combat protocols, they can learn simple lessons from immediate experience, but they don't remember what it was like to be Necrontyre. They don't remember the war in heaven, except as vague impressions of conflict that inform their behavior on a subconscious level. They are, in effect, biological computers running combat subroutines, and while those subroutines are extremely effective, they aren't conscious in any meaningful sense. The nobility are different. Lords, overlords, pharaohs, and other high-ranking Necrons retained more of their original personality and intelligence through the biotransference. They can still think, plan, strategize, and remember in ways that approach their original organic capacity. But even for them, the 60 million years of stasis created gaps and distortions. Some awaken with their memories intact, able to recall events from the war in heaven with perfect clarity. Others find that their memories have become fragmented, like a video file that's been corrupted, with key moments missing or replaced by static. Still others discover that their memories have merged with those of their tomb, creating false recollections of events they didn't actually witness. The Satan shards present a unique case. These fragments of the star gods, imprisoned within tesseract labyrinths and wielded as weapons by the Necrons, retain vast amounts of knowledge from before and during the war in heaven. They remember things that even the oldest Necron nobility have forgotten. They understand the fundamental workings of reality in ways that make the Imperium's understanding of physics look like primitive superstition. When a Satan shard is released onto the battlefield, it doesn't just bring devastating power, it brings ancient wisdom, the kind of understanding that comes from having existed since the galaxy's formation. But these shards are unpredictable. They are pieces of gods that were shattered specifically because they had proven themselves too dangerous to control. The Necrons have developed elaborate containment systems to keep them imprisoned and docile, but even so, releasing a Cetan shard carries risks. The shard might fulfill its assigned task perfectly, tearing through enemy lines with contemptuous ease, or it might turn on its supposed masters, seeing an opportunity to break free from its imprisonment. The Necrons use them carefully, deploying them only when the potential gain outweighs the risk. What all Necrons share, regardless of their level of consciousness or memory retention, is the weight of their experience. Even if they can't consciously recall every battle they fought during the war in heaven, those experiences shaped them at a fundamental level. They developed instincts, tactical reflexes, patterns of behavior that prove successful across millions of years of warfare. These instincts don't go away just because the conscious memories have faded. They persist as buried knowledge, informing decisions that seem intuitive but are actually based on eons of accumulated experience. This is why the Necrons' approach to warfare seems so alien to younger races. When an Imperial commander makes a tactical decision, they're drawing on maybe a few decades of personal experience, plus the accumulated wisdom of previous commanders passed down through written records and oral tradition. When a Necron overlord makes a similar decision, they might be drawing on 5 million years of direct experience in similar situations, plus another 60 million years of collective knowledge encoded into their tomb's data systems. The disparity is so vast that it becomes almost meaningless to compare them. Consider what this means in practical terms. The Necrons fought against enemies during the war in heaven that possessed technologies and capabilities that no current race can match. The Old Ones could manipulate reality itself through their mastery of psychic power. They created entire species as weapons, engineering the Krork, ancestors of the modern Orcs, to be perfect warriors, crafting the Eldari to be potent psykers, designing countless other races to fulfill specific battlefield roles. They wielded the webway as both transportation network and tactical advantage, allowing them to appear anywhere in the galaxy without warning, and the Necrons beat them. They learned how to counter psychic abilities through sheer technological supremacy. They developed weapons that could track enemies through the webway and strike at them even in their supposedly safe havens. They adapted to every strategy the Old Ones employed, eventually driving them to extinction despite being initially outmatched. The lessons learned from that conflict inform every decision the Necrons make in the 41st Millennium. They know, at a bone-deep level, that no enemy is truly invincible. Every race has weaknesses. Every technology has counters. Every tactical advantage can be overcome with sufficient patience and ingenuity. But they also know something equally important. Not every battle needs to be fought immediately. Sometimes the correct response to a threat is to withdraw, gather information, and return later with the appropriate countermeasures. This is especially true when dealing with enemies that represent a disproportionate resource expenditure relative to the potential gain. The Necrons categorize threats based on a complex calculus that takes into account multiple factors. How much damage can this enemy inflict before being neutralized? How many resources will be required to defeat them? What strategic objective does their destruction serve? Can they be avoided, manipulated, or redirected rather than confronted directly? For most enemies, the answers to these questions result in straightforward combat. Orc war parties can be scattered with minimal expenditure of force. Imperial Guard regiments, even in large numbers, pose little threat to Necron warriors, whose bodies can be repaired almost indefinitely. Even Space Marines, formidable as they are, can be overcome through superior technology and tactical coordination. But some enemies fall into a different category. Some enemies represent such a disparity between the resources required to defeat them and the actual strategic value of their destruction that engaging them becomes counterproductive. The Necrons don't fear these enemies. Fear is an emotion they largely lack. They simply recognize that fighting them is inefficient, that the cost-benefit analysis doesn't favor direct engagement, and few enemies in the 41st Millennium fit this category as perfectly as the ancient Custodian Dreadnoughts. The strategic mind of living metal. To understand Necron's strategic thinking, you must first abandon any notions of warfare as you understand it. When the Imperium plans a campaign, they think in terms of objectives that might be achieved within a human lifetime, perhaps a few decades if they're being particularly ambitious. When orcs gather for a war, they think about immediate goals: the next fight, the next conquest, the next opportunity to engage in glorious violence. Even the Aeldari, with their extended lifespans and ability to perceive probable futures, tend to focus on outcomes measurable within centuries or millennia at most. The Necrons think differently. Their strategic planning operates on timeframes that dwarf those of other races. When a Necron overlord formulates a strategy, they might be setting pieces in motion for a campaign that won't reach fruition for 10,000 years. They might sacrifice entire armies in apparently pointless engagements, only to reveal thousands of years later that those losses were part of a larger pattern, a calculated maneuver in a game of such complexity that no organic mind could fully comprehend it. The Silent King himself is pursuing objectives that may not be completed for another million years. And he sees this not as an impossibly long timescale, but as merely appropriate for the task at hand. This long-term perspective fundamentally changes how the Necrons evaluate tactical situations. For a space marine, every battle is potentially their last, which means every fight must be approached with maximum commitment. For an Imperial Guard soldier, the duration of the war might span their entire career, so each engagement feels momentous, important, worth risking everything to win. But for a Necron warrior whose body will be repaired and rebuilt no matter how badly it's damaged, whose consciousness might persist for millions of years more, individual battles become almost meaningless, except as they contribute to larger objectives. The Necrons possess a technological advantage that enables this strategic approach: their reanimation protocols. When a Necron warrior is destroyed in battle, their consciousness doesn't die. Instead, their body dissolves into a cloud of microscopic scarabs that retreat to the tomb complex, where they begin reconstructing the warrior's form. The process takes time, and catastrophic enough damage can overcome even these repair systems. But for the vast majority of casualties, death is a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent loss. This means the Necrons don't experience attrition in the same way other races do. They don't lose soldiers whose training represents years of investment. They don't suffer the gradual degradation of combat effectiveness that comes from replacing veterans with inexperienced recruits. Every warrior who falls in one battle simply returns to fight in the next. But reanimation isn't free. The process consumes energy, requires time, and can only function if the tomb's repair facilities remain operational. If too many warriors are destroyed too quickly, the systems become overwhelmed, and permanent losses start to accumulate. If the tomb itself is damaged or its power supply disrupted, reanimation might fail entirely, leaving the destroyed warriors permanently offline. This means the Necrons must carefully manage their losses, even though individual casualties can be recovered. It's not about preserving lives, because their warriors aren't truly alive. It's about maintaining operational capacity, ensuring that their forces remain effective across the vast timescales over which they plan. This is where the phase-out protocol becomes crucial to understanding Necron tactics. Every Necron force has a pre-programmed threshold for acceptable losses. When casualties reach that threshold, the entire force automatically phase shifts out of normal space, teleporting back to their tomb complex. This isn't retreat in the traditional sense, where a defeated army flees the battlefield in disorder. It's a calculated extraction, executed with mechanical precision that preserves the remaining forces for future operations. The Necrons don't see this as shameful or as an admission of defeat. It's simply tactical efficiency, the recognition that the current engagement has stopped being cost-effective and should be terminated. From the Necron perspective, every battle is evaluated through a simple rubric. What are we gaining by being here? And what is it costing us? If the answer shows a positive return on investment, the battle continues. If the costs start to outweigh the benefits, They phase out and reassess. This might seem cold and mechanical, which makes sense given that they are literally cold and mechanical, but it's also remarkably effective. The Necrons don't throw away forces in futile last stands. They don't commit to battles that can't be won. They don't let pride or honor or any other emotion drive them into tactically unsound decisions. Consider how this applies to specific types of enemies. When facing Imperial Guard, the Necrons know they can inflict casualties at a favorable exchange ratio. Their Gauss flayers strip flesh from bone atom by atom, while the laser guns of the Guardsmen merely char their necrodermis. Even if they eventually phase out, they've likely inflicted enough damage to disrupt Imperial operations in the region, while suffering losses that will be completely recovered within days or weeks. The cost-benefit analysis favors engagement. When facing Space Marines, the calculation becomes more complex, but still manageable. The Astartes are far more durable and dangerous than regular humans, capable of surviving hits that would kill an ordinary soldier and returning fire with weapons that can actually threaten Necron warriors. But they're still mortal, still vulnerable to the devastating firepower that Necron weapons can bring to bear. More importantly, every Space Marine that falls is a permanent loss for the Imperium, a warrior whose creation required decades of training and enhancement who cannot be easily replaced. Every Necron that falls is a temporary loss, recoverable through reanimation protocols. If a battle between Necrons and Space Marines results in equal casualties on both sides, the Necrons have effectively won, because their losses will be erased while the Space Marines' losses are permanent. But when the Necrons encounter Custodian Dreadnoughts, this comfortable calculus falls apart entirely. These are warriors who combine the martial excellence of the Custodian Guard with the durability and firepower of a Dreadnought chassis. They cannot be destroyed quickly. They cannot be overcome through simple numerical superiority. And perhaps most importantly, from the Necron perspective, destroying them yields almost no strategic benefit while consuming enormous amounts of resources. When ancient technology meets its match, the Necrons possess weapons technology that is, by almost any measure, superior to anything the Imperium can field. Their Gauss weapons operate on principles that disassemble matter at the atomic level, stripping away electrons and then protons and neutrons in a cascade of annihilation that reduces targets to component particles. The effect is devastating against organic matter, which simply comes apart as the molecular bonds holding it together are systematically destroyed. Even armor provides only limited protection, as the Gauss effect works its way through the material layer by layer until it reaches the vulnerable flesh beneath. Against most enemies, this technology is brutally effective. Imperial Guard soldiers caught in Gauss fire literally disintegrate, their bodies dissolving into clouds of atoms. Space Marines fare better due to their enhanced physiology and power armor, but even they cannot withstand sustained Gauss bombardment. The molecular disintegration eats through ceramite plate, strips away the ablative layers, and eventually reaches the Astartes himself. Even the legendary durability of Space Marines provides only temporary protection against weapons designed to unmake matter itself at a fundamental level. But Custodian Dreadnoughts present a very different problem. The auramite armor plating their chassis is far superior to the ceramite used in Space Marine equipment, more resistant to energy weapons, and better able to maintain structural integrity under stress. More importantly, the atomantic shielding systems that every Custodian Dreadnought carries create an energy field that disperses incoming fire across multiple dimensions. Gauss weapons that would strip flesh from bone and turn armor into powder find their effects drastically reduced against atomantic shielding. The energy meant to disassemble matter at the atomic level is instead shunted away, dissipated harmlessly into spaces between spaces that the Imperium's tech priests don't fully understand. This shielding technology is itself a relic from the Dark Age of technology, developed using principles that may have been discovered during humanity's golden age of innovation or may have been inherited from even older sources. The Necrons recognize it immediately, not because they've encountered it before in Imperial hands, but because they've seen similar technologies during the War in Heaven. The Old Ones used comparable defensive systems, manipulating dimensional barriers to protect their fortresses and their most important warriors. The Citan employed energy fields that operated on related principles. These were technologies that the Necrons spent millions of years learning to counter, and they did eventually develop methods to overcome them. But those methods required specialized weapons and tactics that are not part of the standard Necron arsenal. More troubling from the Necron perspective is what lies behind those shields. The warrior entombed within a Custodian Dreadnought isn't simply a skilled fighter. They're one of the most capable individual combatants ever created by humanity, with centuries or even millennia of combat experience informing their every action. Their targeting systems are linked directly to consciousness that can process battlefield information at speeds that approach or exceed the reaction times of Necron warriors. They can predict where enemies will move, adjust their aim to compensate for evasive action, and exploit weaknesses in enemy formations with a precision that comes from perfect understanding of warfare at both tactical and strategic levels. When a Custodian Dreadnought engages Necron warriors, the result is a masterclass in combat efficiency. The massive Dreadspear or Galatus warblade they wield isn't swung randomly. Every strike is calculated to destroy multiple enemies while positioning the Dreadnought for optimal defensive response. The integrated weapons systems lay down fire that precisely targets the most dangerous threats, eliminating Lichguard and Immortals before they can bring their weapons to bear effectively. The Custodian doesn't waste ammunition on targets that are already doomed. They don't expose themselves unnecessarily. Every movement, every shot, every melee strike demonstrates a level of skill that even the most advanced Necron warriors cannot match. This combination of ancient defensive technology and supreme martial skill creates a problem that the Necrons simply cannot solve efficiently. To bring down a single Custodian Dreadnought requires dedicating enormous amounts of firepower, essentially surrounding it with multiple squads, all firing simultaneously to overwhelm its shields through sheer volume rather than precision. Even then, the atomantic shielding will absorb tremendous punishment before failing, and once it does, the auramite armor underneath must still be breached. All the while, the Custodian is tearing through Necron forces with ruthless efficiency, each swing of their blade destroying warriors who will need to be rebuilt, each shot from their weapons eliminating threats with perfect accuracy. The resource calculation becomes clear when examined closely. To neutralize one Custodian Dreadnought might require the temporary destruction of dozens of Necron warriors, multiple vehicles, and a significant expenditure of the exotic ammunition needed to penetrate atomantic shielding once it finally fails. Yes, those warriors can be rebuilt and those vehicles repaired. Yes, the losses are technically temporary. But the time and energy required for those repairs, the strain on the tomb's reanimation systems, the risk that damage might accumulate faster than it can be fixed, these costs mount up quickly, and for what? Destroying a single enemy warrior, however formidable, rarely advances strategic objectives in meaningful ways. Moreover, the Necrons remember facing similar problems during the War in Heaven. The Old Ones fielded warriors enhanced through psychic means to heights of capability that approached godlike. The Krork, engineered to be perfect soldiers, were individually more dangerous than entire squads of Necron warriors. The Proto-Aeldari, infused with warp energy and wielding psychic powers that could tear apart reality itself, required tremendous resources to defeat. The Necrons learned, over millions of years of conflict, that some enemies simply weren't worth engaging directly if alternative approaches existed. The preferred Necron response to enemies like this was never to match them in single combat. It was to avoid them, outmaneuver them, attack objectives they couldn't reach in time, and force them to respond to threats on terms favorable to the Necrons rather than their enemies. If a particularly powerful Old One champion defended a fortress, the Necrons didn't waste forces trying to kill them. They bypassed the fortress, struck at the supply lines, and forced the champion to either abandon their position or watch their fortress become irrelevant. If Krork warlords led devastating assaults, the Necrons didn't meet them head-on. They phased out, relocated, and struck elsewhere while the Krork chased ghosts. This same tactical philosophy applies to Custodian Dreadnoughts in the 41st Millennium. When Necron forces encounter these warriors, their initial response is to evaluate whether destroying them serves any strategic purpose. Usually, the answer is no. The Custodian Dreadnought might be protecting an Imperial position, but there are almost always alternative approaches to neutralize that position without directly confronting its most powerful defender. The Necrons might phase out of the immediate battle, reposition to strike at a different objective, and force the Imperium to shift their Custodian forces to respond. Or they might simply acknowledge that the resources required to overcome a Custodian Dreadnought exceed the value of whatever objective it defends, and redirect their attention elsewhere entirely. This doesn't mean the Necrons never fight Custodian Dreadnoughts. There are situations where engagement becomes unavoidable, where the strategic calculus demands that a particular position be taken regardless of the defending forces. But even in these cases, the Necrons approach the battle differently than they would against other enemies. They don't commit their forces piecemeal. They don't allow their warriors to be drawn into extended melee combat, where the Custodian's superior skill gives them the greatest advantage. Instead, they employ overwhelming force, surrounding the Dreadnought with concentrated firepower from multiple directions simultaneously, accepting heavy losses in exchange for the certainty that the enemy will eventually be overwhelmed. And if the losses become too heavy, if the cost starts to exceed acceptable parameters, the Necrons simply phase out and try a different approach. They don't see this as failure. They see it as gathering data, learning the enemy's capabilities, identifying weaknesses that can be exploited in future engagements. The battle that ended with a tactical withdrawal becomes preparation for the next battle, which might employ entirely different tactics based on what was learned. This is how they won the war in heaven, by treating warfare as an iterative process that spans incomprehensible timescales, where individual defeats are meaningless and only the final outcome matters. Shadows of the Old Ones. To fully appreciate why the Necrons view Custodian Dreadnoughts with such calculated wariness, we must understand something that even the Imperium itself doesn't fully realize. The Emperor's work in creating the Custodian Guard bears remarkable similarities to the genetic engineering practiced by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven. This isn't coincidence, and it isn't mere parallel evolution of similar technologies. There are echoes of those ancient techniques woven into the very fabric of how Custodians are made, hints that whoever designed their creation process had access to knowledge that should have been lost millions of years before humanity evolved. The Old Ones were masters of genetic manipulation, capable of crafting entire species to fulfill specific purposes. They didn't simply enhance existing life forms. They redesigned them at a fundamental level, altering their very essence to make them into weapons of war. The Krork were engineered to be the perfect warriors, instinctively understanding tactics and growing stronger with each battle. The Eldari were created to be potent psychers, their souls burning bright in the warp and capable of wielding psychic powers that could reshape reality. Each of these creations reflected deep understanding of biology, consciousness, and the relationship between the material universe and the immaterium. The process of creating a custodian, while nominally different in its specifics, follows similar philosophical principles. Each custodian is crafted from infancy, their genetic code rewritten not through the relatively crude process of implanting gene seed organs like with space marines, but through direct manipulation of their fundamental cellular structure. Every cell in their body is altered, enhanced, perfected. Their nervous system is rebuilt to process information faster and more efficiently. Their muscular and skeletal structure is reinforced beyond normal human limits. Their metabolic processes are optimized to a degree that makes even space marines look inferior by comparison. But the similarity goes deeper than mere physical enhancement. The Old One's creations weren't just physically superior, they were psychically attuned, connected to the warp in ways that made them more than the sum of their material components. The Aeldari's souls shone bright in the Imperium, making them naturally gifted psychers. The Krork possessed what could only be described as a psychic gestalt consciousness, growing stronger as more of them gathered together, their collective belief in their own power actually making them more powerful through mechanisms that bypassed normal physical laws. The Custodians display similar characteristics, though the Imperium would never describe them in such terms. Each Custodian is bound to the Emperor through connections that aren't purely physical or even psychological. There's a spiritual or psychic component to their existence that ties them directly to the Master of mankind. They can sense his will, feel his presence even when separated from him by vast distances. Some of the oldest texts, those written during the Unification Wars, describe the Custodians as extensions of the Emperor himself, as though their consciousness was somehow linked to his own. This is remarkably similar to how the Old Ones bound their warrior races to themselves, creating psychic connections that ensured loyalty and allowed for unprecedented coordination. When a Custodian is interred within a Dreadnought, these connections don't sever. If anything, the extended lifespan granted by the Dreadnought's life support systems allows them to maintain and even strengthen these bonds over centuries or millennia. The consciousness within the Dreadnought remains linked to the Emperor, drawing on his presence as a source of determination and will. This makes them extraordinarily resilient psychologically, incapable of falling to despair or corruption in the same way that even space marines sometimes do. They are, in a very real sense, fragments of the Emperor's own will, given physical form and armed with devastating weapons. The Satan shards, those fragments of the star gods that the Necrons keep imprisoned and occasionally release onto the battlefield, recognize this. They remember the Old One's creations. They remember fighting against warriors who were more than just skilled soldiers, who were psychically enhanced and connected to entities of tremendous power. When a Satan shard encounters a Custodian Dreadnought, there's a moment of recognition, a understanding that this is something familiar, despite being crafted by a much younger species. The human Emperor who created these warriors used techniques that echo the Old One's work, suggesting access to knowledge that should have been lost when that ancient race was destroyed. This recognition informs Necron strategic thinking at a deeper level than simple battlefield mathematics. The Necrons didn't just fight the Old One's creations, they eventually overcame them by developing specific countermeasures to their enhancements. They learned how to disrupt the psychic connections that made these warriors so formidable. They developed weapons that targeted not just the physical body, but the spiritual essence that gave them strength. It took millions of years to perfect these techniques, but eventually the Necrons found ways to neutralize even the most powerful of the Old One's champions. The problem is that those specialized weapons and tactics aren't part of the standard Necron arsenal anymore. The technologies developed specifically to counter Old One's creations were designed for a war that ended 60 million years ago. When the Necrons went into hibernation, they didn't bring detailed manuals on how to fight every specific type of enemy they might encounter upon awakening. They brought general-purpose military forces equipped with versatile weapons, suitable for dealing with whatever younger races might have arisen during their sleep. The highly specialized anti-psychic technologies and the complex tactical doctrines developed to fight enhanced warriors like the Old One's champions are still encoded in their Tomb World's databases, but awakening Necrons often lack the context to understand why they would need such things. The Silent King, in his journeys outside the galaxy, has learned much about the current state of galactic affairs. He understands that the Imperium is more than just another primitive species squabbling over territory. He recognizes that the Emperor, whatever he truly is, represents something unprecedented in the current age, a being whose power and knowledge approach or exceed that of entities the Necrons thought extinct. He sees the Custodian Guard as evidence of techniques that shouldn't exist, and he adjusts Necron strategy accordingly. But most Necron overlords who have recently awakened lack this broader perspective. They see enemies that look superficially similar to Space Marines and assume they can be defeated using similar methods, only to discover through painful experience that Custodian Dreadnoughts require something more. This is why encounters between Necrons and Custodian Dreadnoughts often follow a predictable pattern. The Necrons engage initially, expecting to overwhelm the enemy through superior technology and numbers. They discover that their standard tactics are insufficient, that the Custodian is far more dangerous than anticipated. Some Necron forces, particularly those led by less experienced overlords, continue throwing warriors at the problem until losses mount to unacceptable levels. Others, especially those commanded by nobility who retain more of their original intelligence and strategic acumen, quickly recognize the problem and phase out to reassess. The Necrons who have fought Custodian Dreadnoughts multiple times develop a healthy respect for them. Not fear, because fear requires emotions they no longer possess, but a cold recognition that these enemies represent a category of threat requiring special consideration. They start to adjust their tactics, bringing heavier weapons to battles where Custodian presence is confirmed, positioning forces to enable quick phase-outs if the engagement becomes unfavorable, avoiding direct confrontation where alternative approaches exist. They treat Custodian Dreadnoughts similarly to how they might treat a concentration of Imperial Knights or a deployed Titan, as threats that can be overcome, but only at costs that must be carefully weighed against potential gains. The irony is that the Imperium doesn't fully understand why the Necrons often withdraw from battles where Custodians are present. Imperial commanders sometimes interpret this as evidence that the Necrons fear the Emperor's finest warriors, which is true only in the most technical sense. The Necrons don't fear them in any emotional capacity, but they do recognize them as threats that consume disproportionate resources to neutralize. The withdrawal isn't born of cowardice, or even of tactical acknowledgement of superior force. It's a calculated business decision, the recognition that engaging these particular enemies represents poor return on investment compared to striking objectives they don't defend. This fundamental misunderstanding actually works in the Imperium's favor. By deploying Custodians to defend key positions, they can often deter Necron attacks without even fighting, because the Necrons calculate that conquering those positions would cost more than they're worth. But this only works because both sides are playing different games. The Imperium sees each battle as critically important, worth defending with their most elite warriors. The Necrons see each battle as one small move in a game that spans millions of years, worth abandoning if the immediate costs exceed immediate benefits. Eventually, those different perspectives may lead to a confrontation that neither side can avoid, where Custodian Dreadnoughts and Necron warriors meet in battle that must be fought to conclusion. When that day comes, the galaxy will witness what happens when the Emperor's ancient guardians face the last survivors of the war in heaven. The mathematics of immortal warfare. To truly understand Necron strategic thinking, we must examine the actual mathematics that govern their decision-making. When a Necron overlord evaluates whether to engage an enemy force, they process multiple variables through a calculus that has been refined across millions of years of warfare. Each factor is weighted, quantified, and assessed with mechanical precision, resulting in decisions that might seem counterintuitive to races who think in terms of honor, glory, or short-term tactical advantage. The first variable is direct military cost. How many Necron warriors will be destroyed in the process of neutralizing this enemy? The answer determines the strain on the tomb's reanimation protocols. Each warrior destroyed requires energy to rebuild, time for the repair systems to reconstruct their bodies, and resources to restore them to operational status. For a healthy tomb with functioning systems, these costs are manageable for typical battlefield losses. A few dozen warriors destroyed represents perhaps a week of repair time. 100 or more destroyed in a single engagement might take several weeks to restore. But if thousands are destroyed, or if destruction happens repeatedly faster than repairs can keep pace, permanent losses start to accumulate. The second variable is time cost. How long will this engagement take to resolve? For immortal beings operating on millennial timescales, you might think time would be irrelevant. But the Necrons learned during the war in heaven that time is actually one of the most precious resources they possess. Every moment spent fighting one enemy is a moment not spent advancing other objectives. If defeating a Custodian Dreadnought requires committing an entire force for days or weeks of sustained combat, that's time those forces can't be used elsewhere. The opportunity cost becomes significant when multiplied across dozens or hundreds of ongoing campaigns. The third variable is strategic value. What objective does defeating this enemy actually achieve? If the Custodian Dreadnought is defending a position that must be taken to advance Necron territorial control, the strategic value is high. If they're simply in the area, but not directly blocking any critical objective, the value might be minimal. This is where Necron thinking diverges most sharply from that of younger races. They don't fight simply because an enemy is present. They fight only when defeating that enemy advances goals that matter on relevant timescales. The fourth variable is intelligence value. What can be learned from this engagement? The first time a Necron force encounters a Custodian Dreadnought, there's significant value in the engagement, even if it results in a withdrawal. They learn the enemy's capabilities, their weapons' effective ranges, their defensive systems' limitations, their tactical patterns. This information is uploaded to the tomb's central archive and becomes available to all Necron forces in the region. But once that data is gathered, subsequent engagements yield diminishing returns unless the enemy demonstrates new capabilities. The fifth variable is political cost among the Necron dynasties. The nobility of different tomb worlds don't always cooperate effectively. Feuds and rivalries from before the Great Sleep often persisting across millions of years. An overlord who sustains heavy losses without achieving significant victories might find their status among their peers diminished. Conversely, an overlord who consistently achieves objectives while minimizing losses gains influence within the dynasty. This creates pressure to avoid engagements where victory would be costly or uncertain, especially when alternatives exist. When these variables are processed through the Necron's strategic calculus and applied to the specific case of engaging Custodian Dreadnoughts, the mathematics consistently point toward avoidance when possible. Let's walk through a specific example to see how this plays out. Consider a scenario where a Necron force needs to seize control of an Imperial research facility that contains archaeotech they wish to secure. The facility is defended by a mixed force of Imperial Guard, Space Marines, and a single Contemptor Achilles Dreadnought of the Adeptus Custodes. The Necron Overlord, commanding the assault, must evaluate their options. Option 1. Direct assault on the facility, engaging all defending forces, including the Custodian Dreadnought. Military cost. High. The Custodian Dreadnought will destroy dozens of Necron warriors before being overwhelmed. The Space Marines will account for additional losses. Total casualties might reach 100 warriors plus several vehicles, requiring weeks of repair time. Time cost. High. The Custodian Dreadnought cannot be quickly eliminated. The assault might take days of sustained combat, during which the defenders can call for reinforcements. Strategic value. Moderate. The archaeotech is valuable, but not irreplaceable. Other caches likely exist elsewhere. Intelligence value. Low. The Necrons have already fought Custodian Dreadnoughts and understand their capabilities. Political cost. High. Heavy casualties for a moderate gain would reflect poorly on the Overlord's decision-making. Conclusion. Unfavorable cost-benefit ratio. Direct assault not recommended. Option 2. Bypass the facility. Identify the location where the archaeotech will be transported, and ambush the convoy while it's in transit. Military cost: low. Convoy escorts are unlikely to include custodian forces. Casualties might number a dozen warriors at most. Time cost: low to moderate. Tracking the convoy and planning the ambush adds time but less than sustained assault would require. Strategic value: moderate. Same archaeotech, secured with minimal expenditure. Intelligence value: low. Standard ambush tactics, nothing novel learned. Political cost: low. Success with minimal losses enhances the Overlord's reputation for tactical cleverness. Conclusion: favorable cost-benefit ratio. This approach is optimal. Option 3. Phase out entirely, redirecting forces to a different objective while monitoring the facility for future opportunities. Military cost: minimal. Only the energy cost of the phase-out itself. Time cost: low. Forces immediately available for redeployment. Strategic value: low. Objective abandoned. Though temporary surveillance provides future intelligence. Intelligence value: minimal. Limited engagement means limited new information. Political cost: minimal. Acknowledged as prudent resource management rather than failure. Conclusion: acceptable when better opportunities exist elsewhere. The Overlord processes these options and selects option 2, committing to an approach that achieves the objective while avoiding the costly engagement with the Custodian Dreadnought. The Imperial forces, seeing the Necrons withdraw from the facility's vicinity, might interpret this as a successful defense. In reality, the Necrons simply recognized that the most direct path to their goal wasn't the most efficient one. This kind of strategic flexibility is what makes the Necrons so dangerous over long time scales. They don't get emotionally invested in particular battles or obsessed with destroying particular enemies. They can abandon objectives that become too costly, redirect forces to exploit emergent opportunities, and maintain a level of strategic flexibility that races constrained by normal lifespans struggle to match. A human general might feel compelled to attack the facility directly, viewing withdrawal as failure and being unable to accept the political consequences of appearing to retreat from the enemy. A Necron overlord faces no such constraints. They can wait decades or centuries for better opportunities, knowing that their fundamental strategic goals remain unchanged regardless of tactical setbacks. This becomes even more pronounced when we consider the Silent King's grand strategy for the Necron race as a whole. His primary concern isn't defeating the Imperium or any other specific faction. His primary concern is preparing the galaxy for the arrival of the Tyranids, the extragalactic devourers who threaten to consume all life. From his perspective, every battle against Imperial forces, every engagement with chaos, every skirmish with other Xenos races is ultimately a distraction from this larger threat. He needs the Necron dynasties to conserve their strength, to preserve their forces for the truly existential war that approaches. This means avoiding costly engagements whenever possible, especially against enemies like Custodian Dreadnoughts who can inflict disproportionate casualties without contributing meaningfully to anti-Tyranid preparations. Every warrior permanently lost fighting the Emperor's Golden Guardians is one less warrior available when the hive fleets arrive in force. Every resource expended in conflicts that don't advance the grand strategy is waste that the Necrons can ill afford, given the scope of the threat they face. The Silent King's return has slowly shifted Necron strategic thinking across the awakening dynasties. Those overlords who maintain communication with him or his representatives have received guidance emphasizing long-term resource management and strategic patience. They've been taught to evaluate engagements not just based on immediate tactical considerations, but on how they contribute to preparing for the Tyranid threat. This has made Necron forces even more willing to withdraw from unfavorable battles, even more selective about which enemies they commit to fighting, and even more frustratingly evasive from the perspective of enemies who expect more straightforward military behavior. From the outside, this might look like careful risk management or even cautious behavior, but it's neither. It's cold calculation operating on timescales so vast that individual battles become statistically insignificant. It's the application of strategic principles refined across 5 million years of active warfare and 60 million years of analytical assessment. It's decision-making optimized not for glory or honor or even victory in the conventional sense, but for achieving specific objectives with minimum expenditure of irreplaceable resources. When Necrons withdraw from battles against Custodian Dreadnoughts, they're not fleeing. They're refusing to pay a price they deem excessive for a return they consider insufficient. They're making the same kind of decision a business might make when declining to pursue a contract that would be technically profitable, but tie up resources better deployed elsewhere. They're playing a different game than their enemies, one where patience is infinite, defeats are temporary, and only the final outcome matters. Historical encounters, lessons in gold and green. The actual historical record of encounters between Necron forces and Custodian Dreadnoughts is fragmentary at best. The Imperium, for all its bureaucratic obsession with record-keeping, doesn't always document the specific details of enemy forces encountered in battle. After-action reports might note Xenos forces withdrawn after Custodian forces deployed, without specifying exactly what those Xenos forces were or under what circumstances they withdrew. The Necrons, meanwhile, maintain extensive tactical databases, but these are scattered across countless tomb worlds, many of which haven't awakened yet or have damaged memory cores that have corrupted their historical data. What we do know comes from a handful of well-documented engagements where both sides were present and the fighting was significant enough to be recorded in Imperial archives that have survived to the present day. One such engagement took place on the Necron tomb world of Trinect, in the northern reaches of the Segmentum Solar. The tomb world had begun its awakening process, and Imperial sensors detected the energy signatures associated with Necron systems coming online. A strike force was dispatched to investigate and, if possible, destroy the awakening dynasty before it could pose a threat. The strike force was substantial. Multiple regiments of Imperial Guard, several squadrons of Imperial Knights from House Krast, and a full shield company of the Adeptus Custodes, including several venerable Contemptor Dreadnoughts. The Imperials expected heavy resistance, and they weren't disappointed. The Necrons defended their tomb complex with fury, endless waves of warriors emerging from underground chambers to throw themselves against the Imperial advance. The battle raged for weeks, the Imperial forces gradually pushing deeper into the tomb, despite horrific casualties among the Guard regiments. The Custodians and their Dreadnoughts formed the spearhead of the assault, their golden forms cutting through Necron lines like hot blades through ice. Wherever they advanced, Necron forces withered before them. The Contemptor. Dreadnoughts in particular proved devastating, their combination of firepower and martial skill allowing them to destroy dozens of Necron warriors with contemptuous ease. The atomantic shielding protected them from the worst of the Gauss fire that would have crippled lesser machines. For a time, it seemed as though the Imperial forces would achieve total victory, pushing all the way to the tomb's central chambers and destroying the dynasty's leaders before they could fully awaken. Then the Necron's strategic calculus shifted. The defenders had been buying time, allowing their lords and cryptechs to fully activate and assess the situation. Once they completed their analysis, the response was swift and decisive. Rather than continue feeding warriors into a meat grinder where they were being destroyed faster than the tomb's systems could repair them, the Necron nobility ordered a complete withdrawal. The entire defending force phased out simultaneously, teleporting deep into the tomb's lower levels where the Imperial forces couldn't easily follow. From the Imperial perspective, this looked like victory. They had driven the Xenos from the field, inflicted massive casualties, and secured control of the tomb world's upper levels. But the Necrons had achieved exactly what they needed: time for their most important systems and personages to awaken fully. The warriors destroyed in the defense could be rebuilt, The territory lost could be reclaimed later. What mattered was preserving the dynasty's core strength and avoiding further catastrophic losses to the Custodian forces, who were proving so costly to engage. The battle continued in modified form for several more weeks, but the character changed dramatically. The Necrons refused to commit to large-scale engagements, where the Custodians could bring their full power to bear. Instead, they harassed the Imperial forces with hit-and-run attacks, small groups phasing in to strike at vulnerable targets before vanishing. They set ambushes in the tomb's twisting corridors, using their knowledge of the terrain to negate the Imperial advantages in firepower. They targeted the supply lines, keeping the Imperial forces fed and armed, rather than confronting their main strength. Eventually, the Imperial commanders made a crucial mistake. They divided their forces, sending the Custodian Shield Company and their Dreadnoughts to secure one section of the tomb, while the Imperial Knights and Guard regiments pushed into another. The Necrons immediately recognized this as the opportunity they'd been waiting for. They concentrated their full remaining strength against the Imperial Guard and Knights, overwhelming them through sheer numbers and strategic positioning. By the time the Custodians realized what was happening and moved to reinforce, the Guard regiments had been decimated and several Knights destroyed. The Imperial forces were forced to withdraw from the tomb world entirely, their mission incomplete. The Trinek campaign reveals several important lessons about how Necrons approach combat with Custodian forces. First, they don't allow pride or aggression to drive them into unfavorable engagements. When their initial defense proved too costly, they immediately withdrew to preserve their strength. Second, they're willing to sacrifice territory and even suffer substantial losses in exchange for strategic positioning. The upper levels of the tomb could be retaken later. What mattered was preventing the Custodians from reaching the critical systems in the deeper chambers. Third, they actively seek to exploit weaknesses created by Imperial command decisions, attacking when and where the Custodians can't effectively intervene. Another documented encounter occurred during the defense of a shrine world in the Eastern Fringe. The world had no strategic value to either side, except as a symbol, a place of spiritual significance to the Imperium and a former Necrontyr colony that the Awakening dynasty wished to reclaim. When the Necrons attacked, they expected light resistance from local defense forces. Instead, they encountered a small contingent of Custodians who had been present on the Shrine World for reasons that remain unclear in the historical record. The contingent included 2 venerable Contemptor Dreadnoughts. The Necron assault force, led by an overlord whose name has been lost to time, initially attempted to overwhelm the defenders through standard tactics. They deployed overwhelming numbers of warriors, supported by immortals and heavy vehicles. The Custodians met them at the approaches to the main shrine complex, and the slaughter was horrific. The 2 Contemptor Dreadnoughts anchored the defense, their weapons cutting down Necrons in waves, while their shields absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lesser machines. For 3 days, the Necrons threw warriors at this position, suffering casualties that mounted into the hundreds. On the 4th day, the Necron overlord made a different decision. Rather than continue the assault, they simply withdrew their forces from the Shrine World entirely. The contingent of Custodians was too small to pursue or launch offensive operations, and the Necrons calculated that the strategic value of the Shrine World didn't justify the casualties they were sustaining. The Imperium celebrated this as a great victory, proof that the Emperor's warriors were invincible even when vastly outnumbered. The Necrons recorded it as a successful gathering of intelligence on Custodian capabilities and a proper application of the withdrawal protocol when costs exceeded benefits. These engagements, and others like them, scattered through the fragmentary historical record, paint a consistent picture. When Necrons encounter Custodian Dreadnoughts, they initially attempt to overcome them through application of their standard tactical doctrine. When this proves more costly than anticipated, they withdraw and reassess. If the strategic objective is sufficiently important, they return with modified tactics and often with specialized equipment designed to counter the specific threats the Custodians pose. If the objective isn't important enough to justify these additional measures, they simply redirect their forces elsewhere and leave the Custodian defended position alone. The pattern holds even in the most desperate circumstances. During the defense of Cadia, when the forces of chaos broke through the fortress world's defenses and threatened to overwhelm the defenders entirely, Trazyn the Infinite released several warriors from his galleries to aid in the defense, including a Custodian he had somehow acquired for his collection. The Necron warriors present, even amid the chaos of that catastrophic battle, gave the released Custodian a wide berth whenever possible, preferring to engage other enemies rather than expend resources fighting him. This wasn't fear or respect. It was simple tactical efficiency, applied even in the midst of apocalyptic warfare. Imperial strategists have occasionally attempted to exploit this pattern, concentrating Custodian forces at positions they wish to make particularly difficult for the Necrons to assault. This works, but only to a point. The Necrons simply adapt their strategy to work around these strong points rather than through them. They identify objectives that aren't defended by Custodian forces and concentrate their efforts there. They force the Imperium to spread its limited number of Custodians across multiple threatened locations, diluting their effectiveness. They demonstrate a flexibility in strategic thinking that races bound by normal timescales struggle to match. The doctrine of calculated avoidance. Having examined the specific factors that make Custodian Dreadnoughts particularly problematic opponents for Necron forces, we can now understand the broader strategic doctrine that governs how the Necrons approach these encounters. This doctrine has been refined across countless engagements, encoded into the tactical protocols that guide Necron warriors, and transmitted through the nobility's command networks to ensure consistent application across different dynasties and tomb worlds. The doctrine begins with recognition and classification. When Necron forces first encounter an enemy, their warriors immediately begin gathering tactical data: weapon signatures, armor composition, movement patterns, combat effectiveness. This information is processed through pattern-matching algorithms that compare the new enemy against stored profiles of thousands of previously encountered foes. Custodian Dreadnoughts register immediately as a known threat category, one that has been assigned specific response protocols developed through previous encounters. Once classified, the doctrine requires an immediate assessment of strategic necessity. Is engaging this enemy essential to the current objective? Can the objective be achieved through alternative means that avoid direct confrontation? What is the cost-benefit ratio of multiple possible approaches? These questions must be answered before committing forces to battle. Unlike younger races, whose warriors might attack simply because an enemy is present, Necron forces are programmed to engage only when engagement serves strategic purposes. If engagement is deemed necessary, the doctrine specifies a particular escalation pattern. Initial contact uses minimum force sufficient to gauge the enemy's capabilities and identify weaknesses. If this initial engagement reveals vulnerabilities that can be exploited, the assault continues with forces specifically configured to target those weaknesses. If no exploitable vulnerabilities are found and casualties mount above acceptable thresholds, withdrawal protocols activate automatically. This measured approach prevents Necron forces from being drawn into attritional battles that don't serve their larger strategic interests. The doctrine also specifies what happens after withdrawal. The data gathered during the engagement is uploaded to the Tomb World's central archives and distributed to other Necron forces in the region. Cryptechs analyze the information, looking for patterns that might reveal weaknesses or suggest alternative tactical approaches. Overlords adjust their strategic planning to account for the enemy's capabilities. If the objective remains strategically important, new assault plans are formulated that specifically address the problems identified in the initial engagement. If it's determined that the objective's value doesn't justify the resources required to overcome its defenses, it's marked as low priority and forces are redirected elsewhere. Against Custodian Dreadnoughts specifically, the doctrine includes several special considerations. First, never allow Custodian Dreadnoughts to engage Necron forces in close combat if it can be avoided. Their skill in melee is unmatched, and the power weapons they wield can carve through even heavy Necron vehicles. Maintain distance, use overwhelming ranged firepower from multiple angles simultaneously, and focus fire to collapse their shields through sheer volume rather than attempting to penetrate them through precision strikes. Second, identify and exploit any separation between the Custodian Dreadnoughts and their supporting forces. Custodians fight as individuals rather than as coordinated units, which means they can sometimes become isolated from allies who might provide supporting fire or tactical assistance. When this occurs, the Necrons can employ tactics specifically designed to trap or neutralize isolated elite warriors, surrounding them with expendable warriors to tie them down while heavy weapons are brought to bear, using terrain to limit their mobility, or simply phasing out and repositioning to attack objectives the isolated Custodian can't reach in time. Third, be prepared to abandon engagements if casualties exceed projections. The Custodian Dreadnought might be destroyed eventually, but the cost of doing so could be so high that the victory becomes meaningless. Better to withdraw, preserve forces, and find opportunities where the same objectives can be achieved without confronting such formidable opposition. This isn't cowardice, it's strategic flexibility applied at the tactical level. Fourth, when withdrawal is necessary, execute it with perfect coordination to minimize additional casualties. Phase-out protocols must activate simultaneously across the entire force, denying the enemy the opportunity to catch fleeing units in vulnerable positions. Rearguards might sacrifice themselves to cover the withdrawal, but only if their destruction serves to preserve a greater number of warriors who can be more effectively employed elsewhere. The doctrine also addresses psychological factors, though these are less relevant for Necron warriors, whose emotional capacity has been stripped away by the biotransference. The nobility, who retain some measure of consciousness, must be reminded not to view withdrawal as shameful or to become obsessed with revenge against enemies who inflicted heavy casualties. Every engagement is simply data. Every battle a test of tactical approaches, every withdrawal an opportunity to refine strategy for future encounters. Personal pride, anger, or the desire for vengeance are treated as malfunctions to be corrected rather than emotions to be indulged. Interestingly, the doctrine draws explicitly on lessons learned during the War in Heaven. The Old Ones fielded champions and hero units who were individually more powerful than anything the Necrons could deploy at comparable scale. These champions couldn't be defeated through straightforward combat, so the Necrons learned to fight around them rather than against them. They developed tactics that neutralized enemy champions without directly engaging them, destroying supporting forces to leave champions isolated and vulnerable. Attacking objectives, the champions were sworn to protect but couldn't defend simultaneously, using the champion's very power against them by forcing them into situations where their abilities were least effective. These same principles apply to Custodian Dreadnoughts. They're extraordinarily powerful defensive units, capable of holding positions against overwhelming odds. But they're less effective in offensive operations where they must advance into prepared defenses. They excel at protecting specific objectives, but struggle to defend multiple widely separated positions. They're devastating in close combat, but vulnerable to sustained ranged bombardment from multiple directions. By understanding these limitations and adapting tactics accordingly, the Necrons can minimize the threat Custodian Dreadnoughts pose without necessarily destroying them directly. The doctrine also recognizes that different battlefield situations require different responses. In offensive operations where the Necrons are attacking Imperial-held positions, encountering Custodian Dreadnoughts usually triggers immediate re-evaluation. Is there an alternative approach to this objective that avoids the defended position entirely? Can the Custodians be lured away from their defensive positions by threats against other objectives? Would it be more efficient to simply besiege the position and starve it of resources rather than assaulting it directly? The doctrine provides frameworks for making these assessments quickly and implementing the chosen approach without hesitation. In defensive operations where Necrons are protecting their own tomb worlds or conquered territories, Custodian presence is treated differently. Here, the Necrons have advantages of terrain and preparation that they lack in offensive operations. They can prepare ambush positions specifically designed to counter Custodian capabilities, channel enemy movement into killing zones where concentrated fire can overwhelm even atomantic shielding, and use the tomb world's internal defenses to slow Custodian advances while inflicting steady attrition. In these situations, the doctrine permits more aggressive engagement because the cost-benefit ratio shifts in the Necrons' favor when they control the battlefield and can force enemies to attack on terms favorable to the defenders. The broader point the doctrine emphasizes is flexibility. Every battle is unique. Every enemy presents different challenges, and no tactical template can anticipate every possible situation. The goal isn't to create rigid rules that must be followed in all circumstances. The goal is to provide frameworks that help Necron commanders make optimal decisions based on their specific circumstances, while adhering to general principles that have proven successful across millions of years of warfare. When applied to engagements with Custodian Dreadnoughts, this flexibility manifests as a willingness to engage when circumstances favor the Necrons, and to withdraw when they don't. It's not about whether the Custodians can be defeated. Given sufficient resources and appropriate tactics, any enemy can be overcome. It's about whether defeating them in this particular engagement advances Necron's strategic objectives sufficiently to justify the costs. Usually, the answer is no, which is why the Necrons so often choose to withdraw and seek alternative approaches to their goals. Conclusion: playing the longest game. We return now to our starting point, to that moment on countless battlefields across the galaxy when golden warriors in their ancient sarcophagi face skeletal legions of living metal. We understand now why the Necrons so often choose withdrawal over battle when confronting Custodian Dreadnoughts. It's not fear, not cowardice, not even respect for a formidable foe. It's cold calculation executed with the precision that comes from millions of years of experience in warfare at scales that dwarf anything the younger races can comprehend. The Necrons are playing a game that spans eons. Individual battles matter only insofar as they contribute to objectives that might not bear fruit for thousands or even millions of years. They can afford to be patient because they are, for all practical purposes, immortal. They can afford to withdraw from unfavorable battles because those losses will be temporary while their grand strategy remains unchanged. They can afford to let the Imperium celebrate victories that the Necrons view as mere inconveniences in campaigns that will outlast the Imperium itself. When a Necron overlord orders their forces to phase out rather than engage a Custodian Dreadnought, they're making a statement about what truly matters in warfare at cosmic scales. Territory can be retaken, warriors can be rebuilt, objectives can be pursued through alternative means. What cannot be recovered are resources wasted on battles that serve no strategic purpose, forces committed to conflicts that don't advance the ultimate goal of Necron galactic dominance. Every Necron warrior destroyed fighting. A Custodian Dreadnought is one less warrior available for the truly important conflicts yet to come. The Imperium, trapped in its 10,000-year decline, fighting desperately just to survive from one crisis to the next, cannot think this way. They must defend every position, contest every incursion, treat every battle as potentially decisive because from their perspective, it might be. They live in a perpetual state of emergency where giving ground today might mean extinction tomorrow. But the Necrons remember when the galaxy was young. They remember winning wars that lasted millions of years. They know that patience and strategic discipline will eventually yield victory, even when individual battles are lost. This is ultimately why the Necrons won't fight ancient Custodian Dreadnoughts unless they absolutely must. Not because they can't win, but because winning that particular fight, in that particular moment, doesn't matter enough to justify the cost. The Custodian might destroy dozens of Necron warriors before falling. Those warriors will need weeks to rebuild. The tomb's systems will be strained. Other objectives will be delayed. And for what? To eliminate one enemy warrior, however formidable, from a battle space containing billions. The mathematics simply don't support it. So they withdraw. They phase out, their forms dissolving into clouds of microscopic machines that teleport back to their tombs. They leave the battlefield to the Imperium. Let them claim victory. Let them think the Necrons feared the Emperor's golden guardians. It doesn't matter what the Imperium thinks. It doesn't matter what anyone thinks. What matters is that the Necrons' grand strategy continues unimpeded, their forces preserved, their long-term objectives uncompromised by the outcome of battles that history will forget in the blink of an eye. When humanity has faded into darkness, when the Imperium has collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and corruption, when the galaxy has moved on to its next epoch, the Necrons will still be there. They will remember these battles, these withdrawals, these calculated decisions to avoid costly engagements. And they will use that accumulated knowledge to achieve final victory in a war that began before humanity's ancestors crawled out of the oceans and will continue long after humanity's final descendants have turned to dust. That is the terrible genius of the Necrons. They understand something that even the immortal Emperor may not have fully grasped when he created his Custodian Guard. That in a game played across geological timescales, he who fights every battle eventually loses to he who chooses his battles wisely. The Custodian Dreadnoughts are magnificent warriors, perhaps the finest individual combatants the galaxy has ever produced. But magnificence in combat is not the same as strategic victory. And in the longest game ever played, the Necrons have already demonstrated they know how to win. The Golden Guardians will continue to stand vigil over humanity's most important assets, their ancient sarcophagi holding consciousnesses that have served the Emperor for millennia. The skeletal legions will continue to awaken from tombs buried deep beneath dead worlds, their emerald eyes glowing with cold intelligence that predates human civilization. And when they meet, as they inevitably will in battles yet to come, the Necrons will make the same calculation they always make. Is this fight worth fighting? Does this battle advance our strategic objectives? Should we engage, or should we withdraw and find a better way? More often than not, the answer will be withdrawal. Not because they can't win, but because winning isn't worth what it costs. And that, more than any weapon or technology or tactical brilliance, is what makes the Necrons so dangerous. They think like immortals, plan like entities who can wait out empires, and execute strategies that treat individual defeats as meaningless in service of eventual victory. The Imperium of Man calls them mindless automatons, soulless machines, Xeno's abominations, fit only for destruction. But those who have studied them, who have survived encounters with them, who have watched them adapt and evolve their tactics over decades or centuries of conflict, know differently. The Necrons are ancient beyond measure, strategic beyond compare, and patient beyond comprehension. They are what humanity might have become if it had taken a different path millions of years ago. And they are winning, slowly but inexorably, one calculated withdrawal at a time. So when you see a Custodian Dreadnought stride onto the battlefield in all its golden glory, weapons charged and shields glowing with ancient power, remember this: the Necrons who face it aren't afraid. They're doing math. And more often than not, the math says to let this one go, to fight another day, to choose another target. Because in the longest game, the player who survives to the final move is the one who wins. And the Necrons have been playing this game since before the stars learned to dream. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Necron strategic thinking and the terrifying martial prowess of the Custodian Guard, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the vast darkness of the 41st millennium, from the silent tombs of sleeping dynasties to the golden halls of the imperial palace. Thank you for watching, and may the Emperor protect.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.